Welcome to Mr. Phantom Channel, a place where spiritual mysteries and ghostly stories are unveiled. This is not for the faint of heart, but a doorway into another realm, a world where the shadows murmur the truth. If you're a fan of spine-chilling tales and the supernatural, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting explorations. Get ready. The darkness holds secrets waiting to be discovered. The spirit behind the doorbell camera. My name is Nathan Collins, and this story took place when I was about 11 years old. My cousin, Ryan Walker, and I shared a deep fascination with the supernatural. We weren't just kids who enjoyed ghost stories. We actively sought out anything eerie. Growing up in Ashfield, New York, a town steeped in history and rumors of hauntings, we had the perfect environment to fuel our curiosity. The story unfolded in my grandmother's house, an old, creaky building nestled at the edge of town. Grandma Eleanor's home was surrounded by dense woods and had a charm that felt both inviting and unsettling. She had recently installed a modern doorbell camera, and we couldn't resist the opportunity to use it for our next ghost hunting adventure. It was a gray, overcast autumn afternoon when Ryan and I decided to explore the camera footage. While the adults gathered in the backyard, we snuck into the living room, eager to find something spooky. First, the recordings were uneventful, just the usual rustling of leaves and the occasional squirrel darting past the porch. About 10 minutes after leaving the camera, we returned to find my aunt, Linda, resting on the couch nearby. She was battling cancer, and though she looked tired, she remained her usual composed self. When she saw us approach, she said something that sent a chill down my spine. Someone just rang the doorbell. Ryan and I exchanged nervous glances. We immediately checked the footage, but to our surprise, there was no one near the porch for at least 30 minutes. "It must be broken," Ryan said, but his voice wavered. Aunt Linda gave us a faint smile. "Maybe it's Grandpa Arthur checking in." Her words were meant to comfort us, but they did the opposite. Grandpa Arthur had passed away 2 months earlier. Determined to uncover the truth, Ryan and I spent the next hour glued to the camera. First, everything was quiet. Then, just as we were about to give up, we saw it, a shadow darting across the screen. It moved so quickly that we could barely register its form, but it was unmistakably humanoid. "It's just a trick of the light," I whispered, trying to convince myself. Ryan shook his head. "Look closer." The shadow moved again, this time slower, as if aware of the camera. It stopped at the edge of the frame, hovering as though it were watching us. Then, it abruptly disappeared toward the backyard. Without thinking, we ran outside to tell the adults. But when we described what we'd seen, they only laughed. "Your imaginations are running wild," my dad said, ruffling my hair. Even Aunt Linda seemed skeptical, despite her earlier comment. "Maybe it's just a bird," she suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. That night, Ryan and I couldn't stop thinking about the shadow. We decided to sleep in the same room, hoping to shake off the lingering unease. But as the hours crept by, the house seemed to come alive with strange noises. Around midnight, we heard faint tapping on the windows. First, we thought it was the wind, but the taps grew more rhythmic, deliberate. Then came the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, pacing outside our bedroom door. Ryan and I froze, barely daring to breathe. When the footsteps stopped, we mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, as though someone or something had just been there. The next morning, We confided in Grandma Eleanor. To our surprise, she didn't dismiss our fears. Instead, she shared a story about Grandpa Arthur. "Your grandfather was a deeply spiritual man," she began. "He always believed that something followed him, something that couldn't find peace." She recounted how Grandpa often heard whispers late at night or saw fleeting shadows in the corners of rooms. On one occasion, he woke up to find the family Bible lying open on the floor, though no one had touched it. But he was never afraid. Grandma added, "He said it wasn't malicious, just lost." Her words gave me a strange sense of comfort, but they didn't explain what we had seen. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences escalated. One evening, as Ryan and I watched TV in the living room, the doorbell rang again. This time, the sound was accompanied by a sharp, sudden coldness that filled the room. We checked the camera, but there was no one there, just the same shadow hovering near the edge of the frame. Later that night, Aunt Linda claimed she heard someone whisper her name while she was alone in her room. "It sounded like Arthur," she said, her voice trembling. The idea that Grandpa's spirit might be trying to communicate was both comforting and terrifying. The climax came a week later. Ryan and I decided to set up a late-night vigil, determined to catch the shadow on camera once and for all. Armed with flashlights and snacks, we camped out in the living room, our eyes fixed on the monitor. Around 3 a.m., the shadow appeared. This time, it didn't dart away. Instead, it moved slowly toward the camera, its form becoming more distinct. It was a man tall, with indistinct features and an aura of sadness. Suddenly, the screen went black. At that exact moment, the door to the backyard slammed shut with a deafening bang. We grabbed our flashlights and ran outside, but the yard was empty. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. The next day, Grandma Eleanor made a startling discovery. While cleaning out Grandpa's old study, she found a collection of letters he had written but never sent. In one of them, he described seeing a shadowy figure that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "It's always there," he wrote, "not threatening, but watching. I think it wants something from me." The letter sent shivers down my spine. Was the shadow we saw the same entity Grandpa had written about? And if so, what did it want? Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened during those weeks at Grandma Eleanor's house. Ryan and I still talk about it sometimes, replaying the events in our minds and trying to make sense of them. The doorbell camera was eventually replaced, but the memory of that shadow remains vivid. I often wonder if it was truly Grandpa Arthur or something else entirely. Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on all of us. One thing is certain: Ashfield's ghosts are more than just stories, and some spirits linger longer than we'd like to believe. The Whisper from the Lake. Jack Green, a 34-year-old man, had spent his entire life in Sydney, Australia, with a demanding office job. His daily runs at Centennial Park were his sanctuary. The vast park, with its ancient trees, sprawling lawns, and a serene lake, offered a moment of peace amidst the bustling city. The lake, teeming with koi fish and serene water lilies, was a magnet for families and nature lovers. Jack often sat on an old wooden bench near the lake, tossing bits of bread to the fish and enjoying the stillness after long workdays. But one fateful evening in June, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, everything changed. Jack arrived later than usual. The park was eerily quiet, the usual chatter of joggers and families replaced by an unsettling silence. He made his way to the familiar wooden bench, watching as the soft ripples of the lake reflected the fading light. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the stillness. First, it was so soft that Jack thought it might have been the wind or a rustling leaf. But then it grew louder, clearer, more distinct. "I'm hungry." The voice was hoarse, faint yet chilling. It seemed to come from the lake itself. Jack froze, a cold shiver running down his spine. He scanned the area, but there was no one around. The lake was calm, the surface undisturbed except for a few lazy ripples. Dismissing it as his imagination, Jack left the park quickly, the voice echoing in his mind. That night, Jack returned to his apartment in Darlinghurst, a quiet neighborhood not far from Centennial Park. But the peace he sought eluded him. Jack's sleep was plagued by a vivid nightmare. He found himself standing by the lake. The water was inky black, reflecting no light. From the center of the lake, a shadowy figure emerged. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with long, wet hair covering most of his face. His arms stretched unnaturally long, ending in claw-like fingers that gently skimmed the lake's surface. Slowly, the figure raised its head. Its sunken face and glowing red eyes stared straight at Jack. "I'm hungry." The voice reverberated through the dream, freezing Jack in terror. He woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heaving as if he had been running for miles. The darkness of his bedroom felt oppressive, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond his sight. The nightmare repeated itself night after night. Each time, the figure in the lake grew closer, its voice more insistent. Jack stopped going to Centennial Park, but even that didn't bring him peace. 2 months later, Jack decided to confront his fear. He convinced himself that the nightmares were just his mind playing tricks. Fueled by stress and fatigue, armed with a bag of breadcrumbs, he returned to Centennial Park. The lake was as serene as ever. Jack sat on the bench, scattering crumbs into the water. The koi fish darted to the surface, their vibrant colors glinting in the sunlight. The tranquility almost convinced Jack that everything was normal. But as twilight fell, the mood of the park shifted. Shadows lengthened, and an unnatural stillness settled over the lake. Jack felt an inexplicable weight in the air, as if he were being watched. Then he saw it, a faint ripple in the water. His heart pounded as he strained to see what was causing it. A whirlpool formed at the lake's center, spiraling downward into a dark abyss. Jack's breath hitched as he realized this was no ordinary phenomenon. From the whirlpool, the shadowy figure from Jack's nightmares emerged. Its gaunt frame rose slowly, water dripping from its hair and clawed hands, the glowing red eyes fixed on Jack, who was frozen in terror. "I'm hungry, but not for food. I hunger for souls." The voice was cold and hollow, slicing through the stillness like a blade. Jack wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The figure moved closer, the steps eerily slow and deliberate. As it reached the edge of the lake, the figure extended a clawed hand toward Jack. His mind screamed for him to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. Suddenly, the figure spoke again, its tone shifting from menacing to desperate. "Help me, I'm trapped." The words jolted Jack out of his paralysis. Gathering every ounce of courage, he turned and ran, not stopping until he was far from the lake. Determined to find answers, Jack spent the next day researching Centennial Park's history. He scoured old newspapers and archives until he stumbled upon an article from 1947. It told the story of Edward Hargrove, a fisherman who had lived near the park. Edward mysteriously disappeared one evening while fishing at the lake. His boat was found adrift, but his body was never recovered. Intrigued, Jack sought out Margaret Turner, an elderly resident who had lived near the park for decades. When he recounted his experiences, Margaret's face turned pale. "I've seen him," she whispered. "Many have. Edward's spirit is said to haunt the lake, bound by a curse. He was accused of stealing from the community, and when he tried to flee, he drowned in that lake. They say his soul can't rest." Margaret warned Jack to stay away from the lake, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Edward's spirit was reaching out to him for help. Despite his fear, Jack returned to Centennial Park one last time. Armed with a flashlight and a small wooden cross, he approached the lake under the cover of night. The air was thick with fog, and the faint glow of streetlights barely penetrated the darkness. As he neared the lake, Jack noticed the water was unnaturally still. He whispered a prayer and stepped closer. The whirlpool appeared again, larger and more menacing than before. Edward's ghost emerged, his form clearer and more solid than Jack had ever seen. His red eyes burned with intensity, but his expression was one of sorrow rather than malice. "Please, free me," Edward pleaded. Jack hesitated but then raised the wooden cross, reciting a prayer he barely remembered. The whirlpool churned violently, and Edward let out an anguished scream. The lake glowed with an otherworldly light, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. Since that night, Jack has never returned to Centennial Park. The nightmares ceased, and the lake seemed to reclaim its former tranquility. But Jack knows better than to believe the story is truly over. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he feels a cold breeze against his skin and hears a faint whisper in the wind. "Thank you," though he's unsure if it's Edward's gratitude or a lingering echo of the curse. Jack knows one thing for certain: the lake holds secrets that are best left undisturbed. The night of the haunted cemetery. It was the autumn of 2005, and the air in Ashfield, a small town in rural England, had turned crisp with the arrival of the season. The town, known for its quiet charm and historical landmarks, also had its share of urban legends. One of the most popular tales revolved around St. Mary's Cemetery, an old burial ground at the edge of town, rumored to be haunted. On a chilly Friday evening, my close friends Emma, Lucas, Eleanor, and I sat in my dimly lit living room, scrolling through scary stories on the internet. Lucas, ever the thrill seeker, suddenly said, "Why don't we visit St. Mary's tonight? See if the stories are true." I hesitated. The idea of walking into a graveyard known for its hauntings wasn't appealing, but the others quickly jumped on board. After a bit of persuasion, I reluctantly agreed. We decided to take 2 cars. Lucas would drive his, and I would drive mine with Emma and Eleanor. The drive to St. Mary's was unsettling from the start. The road leading to the cemetery was narrow and surrounded by tall, shadowy trees that seemed to stretch endlessly. The faint light of the moon barely penetrated the canopy, casting eerie shapes on the ground. As we drove, Eleanor, sitting in the back seat, nervously joked, "What if we actually see something, like a ghost?" Emma laughed but admitted, "Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised. This town's history is full of creepy stories." We arrived at the cemetery just after 10 p.m. The wrought iron gates were rusted and locked, but Lucas, ever the resourceful one, found a gap in the fence. We parked our cars outside and squeezed through the opening. St. Mary's Cemetery was hauntingly beautiful. The moonlight painted the tombstones in a pale glow, and the cool night air carried the faint scent of damp earth. Rows of old gravestones stretched out before us, their inscriptions weathered by time. We wandered between the graves, occasionally pausing to read the names and dates etched into the stones. Most were from the 1800s, and some had elaborate carvings of angels or crosses. But the beauty of the place didn't erase the oppressive sense of unease that hung in the air. It felt as though we were being watched. As we approached the heart of the cemetery, Lucas suddenly froze and pointed ahead. "Did you see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look. First, there was nothing but shadows. But then, we saw it, a small figure darting between the graves. It was fleeting, barely more than a silhouette, but unmistakably human in shape. "What was that?" Eleanor gasped. "Maybe an animal?" Emma suggested, though her voice wavered with doubt. Lucas wasn't convinced. "That was no animal," he muttered. We continued cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cemetery seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through, making us shiver. I could feel my heart pounding as we pressed on. Just as we reached the far end of the cemetery, a loud crash echoed behind us. We spun around to see Lucas's car parked by the fence, its rear bumper illuminated by our flashlights. We hurried back to the car, where Lucas was inspecting the damage. "I heard something slam into the car," he explained, his voice tight with fear. Emma shone her flashlight on the back of the car, and we all froze. There, on the dusty surface of the trunk, were small handprints, too small to belong to any of us. They were smeared, as if something had tried to push the car. "No way," Eleanor whispered. "That's not possible." The atmosphere grew heavier as we stood by the car, trying to make sense of what had happened. Then, breaking the silence, came a sound that sent chills down my spine. The faint, high-pitched giggle of a child. It seemed to come from the cemetery itself. We all turned, our flashlights scanning the tombstones, but there was no one there. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. Lucas nodded, and we all piled back into the cars. As we drove away, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone chasing us. The following morning, unable to shake the events of the night before, I decided to do some research. I visited the local library, combing through old records about St. Mary's Cemetery. What I found sent a chill through me. In the late 1800s, a young girl named Isabel Clark had gone missing near the cemetery. Her body was never found, but her favorite doll had been discovered near one of the graves. Locals whispered that her spirit lingered, searching for the family that never came to find her. When I shared this with the group, Eleanor turned pale. "Do you think it was her last night? The handprints, the laughter. It makes sense." Despite our fear, curiosity got the better of us. A week later, we decided to return to the cemetery during the day. This time, we brought along an old EMF detector that Lucas's uncle had used in ghost hunts. The cemetery felt different in daylight, less menacing, almost peaceful. But as we wandered deeper, the detector began to beep faintly. The closer we got to the grave where Isabel's doll had been found, the louder it grew. At the grave, the detector spiked. Lucas held it up, his face pale. "Something's here," he said quietly. Then, out of nowhere, the air turned icy cold. A faint whisper brushed past my ear. "Help me." Lucas suggested that we perform a small ritual to bring Isabel peace. With the help of an old priest from the town, we gathered that evening at the cemetery, armed with candles, holy water, and a prayer for the lost. We stood by her grave as the sun set. The priest recited the prayer, his voice steady despite the growing wind. As he sprinkled holy water on the grave, The air seemed to ripple, as if something unseen was shifting. Then, for the briefest moment, we saw her, a translucent figure of a young girl, standing by the grave. She smiled at us, her eyes filled with gratitude, before fading into the twilight. Though we left the cemetery feeling a sense of closure, the experience stayed with us. Lucas swore he sometimes heard Isabel's laughter in his dreams, and Eleanor claimed she occasionally saw fleeting shadows near her house. As for me, every time I pass by St. Mary's Cemetery, I feel a faint chill and hear the echo of that giggle. Isabel may have found peace, but the memory of that night remains etched in my mind, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. The haunting of Carroll Street. The year was 2012 when I moved into the brick house on Carroll Street, a quaint little place nestled in a quiet suburb. The red brick exterior, a small porch with a swinging chair, and a front yard adorned with a creaky old oak tree gave it a picturesque charm. It seemed perfect, a refuge after my recent divorce. The neighborhood was serene, with its tree-lined streets and occasional chatter of children playing. But the house itself felt strangely detached from this idyllic setting. Perhaps it was the weathered bricks or the creaks and groans that seemed louder than they should have been. I brushed these thoughts aside, focusing instead on settling in and starting afresh. I didn't know anyone in the neighborhood yet, but I had a few pieces of furniture and some wall art to make the house feel like home. Among these items was a wrought iron mirror, its frame adorned with intricate floral patterns and 3 small mirrors embedded in it. It was heavy but elegant and fit perfectly above the kitchen counter, which connected the kitchen to the living area, sunroom, and laundry room. That first evening, I hung the mirror carefully, ensuring it was securely fastened. I admired how it reflected the soft glow of the kitchen lights, casting a warm and inviting atmosphere. But by the next morning, I would regret ever bringing that piece into the house. The first night in the house was uneventful. Exhausted from the move, I collapsed into bed and fell into a deep sleep. It wasn't until the following morning that things began to feel off. As I sat at the kitchen counter, sipping my morning coffee, my eyes drifted to the wrought iron mirror. To my astonishment, the heavy frame tilted forward, as if lifted by an unseen force. For a moment, it hovered mid-air, completely defying gravity, before slamming back against the wall with a deafening crash. Startled, I jumped to my feet, spilling coffee all over the counter. The sound was so loud that I half expected to see the mirror shattered on the floor. But when I approached, I found it still hanging securely, the nails undisturbed. My heart raced as I struggled to find a logical explanation. Was it an earthquake? A gust of wind? But the house was still, and the windows were tightly shut. That evening, as I recounted the incident to my friend Rachel, she dismissed it as a quirk of old houses. Probably just a loose nail or something, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. A few nights later, I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I noticed a shadow dart across the hallway. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. I froze, my pulse quickening. The hallway was dimly lit, and I squinted, trying to discern if someone or something was there. But the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I walked cautiously into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The air felt colder there, almost unnaturally so. Though I found nothing, the unease lingered, like an unseen presence was watching me. One morning, I woke to find deep scratches gouged into the wood of the back door. The marks were jagged, as though made by claws. I inspected them closely, trying to determine their source. Could it have been an animal? But the scratches were too large and too deliberate for any creature I could think of. Max Rachel's usually fearless Labrador provided further validation of my growing unease. When she brought him over to visit, he froze at the threshold of the house, growling softly as he stared toward the kitchen. No amount of coaxing could persuade him to enter. Over the next few weeks, the occurrences became more frequent and more sinister. The house seemed to come alive at night, with creaks and groans that sounded eerily like footsteps. Objects would move on their own, a chair slightly out of place, a cupboard door left ajar. But the most chilling incident happened late one night when I was brushing my teeth. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, I felt a light touch on the back of my neck, as though fingers were brushing against my skin. I spun around, heart pounding, but the bathroom was empty. The sensation lingered, sending a shiver down my spine. Then, just as I turned back to the mirror, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. It sounded like my name, drawn out slowly. Emily. My reflection stared back at me, but for a fleeting second, I thought I saw something else. An unfamiliar shadow in the corner of the mirror. One stormy night, the house revealed its true malevolence. The rain pounded against the windows, and lightning illuminated the rooms in brief, blinding flashes. I was in the kitchen, preparing a late dinner, when I heard the distinct sound of a door slamming upstairs. I froze, knife in hand. The sound came again, louder this time. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured upstairs. The hallway was eerily silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. As I reached the bedroom, the door suddenly swung open on its own, slamming into the wall with such force that it left a dent. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its form shrouded in darkness. For a moment, it just stood there, motionless, then, slowly, turned toward me, though its features were obscured. I could feel its gaze, a cold, penetrating stare that seemed to pierce through my very soul. After that night, I knew I couldn't stay in the house much longer. I reached out to a local historian, hoping to uncover any information about the property's past. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The house had been built in the 1920s and had a dark history. The previous owner, a recluse named Henry Caldwell, was rumored to have dabbled in occult practices. Neighbors often spoke of strange rituals and unexplained phenomena. Caldwell disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had changed hands several times since, with each owner reporting similar experiences before abandoning it. Desperate, I contacted a priest from the nearby church, Father Jonathan, and asked him to bless the house. As he walked through the rooms, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. By the time he reached the kitchen, the house seemed to resist his presence. Doors slammed shut, lights flickered, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the walls. As Father Jonathan continued his blessing, the growling intensified, resonating through the house like an unholy symphony. My breath hitched as I watched the crucifix in his hand tremble. The air grew dense and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I clutched the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, and whispered, "Father, is this normal?" He didn't answer immediately. His face was pale, beads of sweat trickling down his temples. Finally, he looked at me, His voice strained. "Emily, this is not normal. Something doesn't want us here." The moment he spoke those words, the wrought iron mirror, still mounted on the kitchen wall, suddenly fell. It didn't simply drop. It was hurled across the room, shattering on impact. Shards of glass sprayed everywhere, and the sound was deafening. "Leave now," Father Jonathan commanded, his voice rising above the chaos. "Get out of the house." "Emily," I hesitated for a fraction of a second before bolting out the front door. I waited on the lawn, shivering in the cold night air, while Father Jonathan remained inside. From the porch, I could hear his prayers growing louder, clashing with the guttural growls that emanated from the house. After what felt like an eternity, Father Jonathan emerged, his face etched with exhaustion. He sank onto the porch steps, clutching his rosary tightly. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely audible. "Whatever's in there, it's old, powerful, and angry, but it's tied to something, a focus, an object. If we can find it, we might be able to rid the house of this presence." The next morning, Father Jonathan returned with a team of 2 assistants from the church. They combed through the house, searching for anything that might explain the haunting. I joined them, though every step I took felt heavier, as though the house itself were pushing back against us. In the basement, we found an old trunk tucked away in a corner. The air around it was icy, and the moment we touched it, the house seemed to roar in protest. Inside the trunk, we discovered a collection of strange items: a worn leather journal, blackened candles, and a set of runes carved from bone. But what caught Father Jonathan's attention was a tattered piece of parchment bearing a sigil I didn't recognize. "This is a binding symbol," he explained, his voice laced with urgency. "Whoever lived here tried to summon something, and they failed to control it." Father Jonathan decided that an exorcism was the only way to cleanse the house. He warned me that it wouldn't be easy and that the entity would resist with everything it had. I was terrified, but I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. The house had to be freed, if not for me, then for whoever might live here next. That evening, as the sun set and shadows crept across the walls, Father Jonathan prepared the ritual. He and his assistants lit candles in a protective circle in the living room, chanting prayers in Latin. The air grew colder with each passing moment, and the growls returned, louder and more menacing than before. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The candles flickered violently, their flames bending as though caught in a storm. The growls turned into deafening roars, and the floor beneath us trembled. I clutched the rosary Father Jonathan had given me, whispering prayers I barely remembered from childhood. My eyes darted to the shadows, which seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like living things. Then, the entity revealed itself. It emerged from the hallway, a towering figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of red, and its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke. It let out a bone-chilling scream that rattled the windows and sent books flying off the shelves. Father Jonathan stepped forward, holding his crucifix high. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this place." The entity recoiled, its form flickering as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it surged forward, slamming into the invisible barrier of the protective circle. The force was so strong that I fell to my knees, my ears ringing. "It's too strong," one of the assistants shouted. "We need to strengthen the circle." Father Jonathan didn't waver. "Emily, the sigil in the basement. Destroy it. Now." I didn't think, I just acted. bolting toward the basement. I stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. The trunk was still there, its contents untouched since we'd found it. My hands trembled as I pulled out the parchment with the sigil. The moment I touched it, the house erupted in chaos. The walls shook, objects flew through the air, and the air itself seemed to hum with malevolent energy. But I didn't stop. Grabbing a lighter from my pocket, I set the parchment on fire. The reaction was immediate. A guttural scream echoed through the house, so loud it felt like it would split my skull. The flames consumed the parchment, and as the last bit of it turned to ash, the chaos subsided. The air grew still, and an oppressive silence fell over the house. When I returned upstairs, Father Jonathan was slumped on the floor, his face pale but relieved. "It's done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's over." In the days that followed, the house felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive weight lifted, but I couldn't shake the memories of what had happened. I decided to sell the house and move elsewhere, leaving the past behind. Father Jonathan checked in on me regularly, assuring me that the entity was gone for good. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the glowing red eyes and the guttural growls that had filled the house. Though the house on Carroll Street was no longer mine, its memory remains etched in my mind, a chilling reminder of the thin veil between our world and the unknown. Thank you for spending your time with us tonight, exploring these mysterious and spine-chilling stories. If these tales have sparked your curiosity or left you with unforgettable feelings, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've had similar paranormal experiences that you'd like to share, feel free to send your story to the email address provided in the description. Who knows? Your story might become part of our journey into the spiritual world in a future episode. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our haunting tales. See you in the next episode, and remember, always keep a light by your side.